The Ethiopian Bible describes what Jesus did. During the 3 days he was dead something is sitting in the oldest Christian Bible in the world that the Western Church has never wanted to discuss. Not because it contradicts the resurrection, because it explains it with a level of detail that raises questions nobody has been willing to answer publicly. The Ethiopian Bible contains 81 books. The Protestant Bible contains 66. The difference is not minor textual variation. 15 entire books exist in the Ethiopian canon that do not appear in Western scripture, and several of them describe in specific and sequential language what happened to Jesus between the moment he died on the cross and the moment he walked out of the tomb 3 days later. Not the surface account most people know, not simply that he rose, what he did during those 72 hours, where he went, what he entered, what he encountered there, what he said, what he took back. And why the version of the story preserved in Ethiopia is the one that matches the older traditions, the Enoch manuscripts, the Gaze texts, locked in Axum for centuries, and the structural map of the underworld that appears in nearly identical form across ancient civilizations that had no contact with each other. If this kind of hidden scriptural history is what you want to keep hearing about, subscribe now. This channel covers what was removed from Western Bibles and why it matters. Now let's go inside the text. This is not a theological argument. It is a textual one. The manuscripts exist. The language is specific. What you are about to hear is what the Ethiopian Bible actually says. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has been Christian since the 4th century CE, predating most of Western Christendom by several hundred years. But the more significant fact is not when they converted. It is which texts they chose to preserve, and which councils they chose to ignore. In 364 CE, the Council of Laodicea stripped the biblical canon of dozens of texts, including the entire book of Enoch, which had been quoted directly by the Apostle Jude in the New Testament and cited approvingly by early church fathers, including Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, and Irenaeus. The Ethiopian church attended none of those councils. They were already working from a canon established directly through the Apostle Philip's encounter with the Ethiopian eunuch recorded in Acts 8, and through the later ministry of the 9 saints. Syrian missionaries who arrived in Ethiopia in the late 5th century carrying manuscripts the Western Church would later classify as non-canonical. The result is a biblical canon that preserved texts now only available elsewhere as fragments, manuscripts with no Greek or Latin lineage, Gaze originals representing the oldest surviving version of certain passages in existence. The Book of Enoch in the Ethiopian canon is not a translation. It is the source text. The Gaze manuscript tradition at Axum is the foundation from which every other surviving version derives. This matters enormously for the question of what Jesus did during his 3 days in death, because the answers are not in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. They are in texts the Ethiopian church kept when everyone else let them disappear. The Book of Enoch provides the architectural description. Chapter 22, preserved in complete form in the Gaze manuscripts and in fragmentary form among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, describes an encounter Enoch had with the underworld. He was taken to a place beyond a great mountain where 4 hollow spaces were carved into the rock, separated from each other by physical walls, each one holding a different category of the dead. The first hollow space held the righteous dead, those who died in accordance with God's will, awaiting the day of resurrection. The text specifies that they wait in brightness, their spirits at rest, preserved until the day of judgment when they will be released. They are not being punished, but they cannot leave. The second hollow space held sinners who died without suffering any punishment on earth. The Gaze term used in this passage carries the connotation of incompleteness, a debt unpaid, an account still open. These souls wait in darkness but not in active torment. Their judgment has not yet been rendered. The third hollow space held those who were murdered, whose blood cried out for vengeance. Enoch describes their voices as audible inside the chamber, a continuous cry that does not cease. The text says their cry is heard until their blood is avenged. The fourth hollow space held the fallen watchers, the angels described in chapters 6 through 10 of Enoch who descended to earth before the flood, corrupted human civilization, and were imprisoned there until the day of final judgment. This is the structure. 4 compartments, separated by walls, holding different categories of beings at different levels of accountability. It is not a symbolic description. The Gaze text, as Dr. Ephraim Isaac noted in his 1983 Oxford translation from the Ethiopian manuscripts, uses the same vocabulary for these divisions that ancient builders used to describe architectural partitions in physical structures. Enoch is describing geography, not metaphor. He visited a place, he recorded what he saw. The Ethiopian church read that record and built their understanding of the descent of Christ directly on top of it. Now here is the connection the Western Church never made explicit, because making it explicit requires acknowledging Enoch as a foundational text rather than an excluded one. Paul, writing to the Ephesians in chapter 4, verses 8 through 10, quotes Psalm 68 and then adds an interpretive statement. He who descended is the one who also ascended far above all the heavens, that he might fill all things. The descent Paul references precedes the ascension. It is not the same event. Something happened in between, and Paul considered it significant enough to write about, while leaving the details out. Peter is less restrained. In his first letter, chapter 3, verses 18 through 20, he states directly that Christ, having been put to death in the flesh, was made alive in the spirit, and in that state went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, those who formerly did not obey. The spirits in prison. The text gives a location. Enoch gave the compartments. The question has always been, which compartment and what exactly happened when Jesus arrived there? The Ethiopian canon contains a text known as the Lafafa Sedek, which translates from Ge'ez as the bandlet of righteousness. This is a liturgical and theological document used in Ethiopian Orthodox practice, and containing passages that describe the descent of Christ into Sheol in language that does not appear in Western versions of the same events. The text is ancient, its Ge'ez form predating most of the manuscript traditions the Western Church relies on. The Lafafa Sedek describes the moment of Christ's death not as a conclusion, but as a departure. The language is directional. The spirit does not simply leave the body, it descends. The Ge'ez term used carries the sense of downward penetration into a sealed space, the way a diver enters water rather than the way a flame goes out. Direction matters in this text. Every verb of motion is specified. Down is the operative word. What the text describes next is the encounter with the gates. The underworld in the Ethiopian tradition, drawing on the Enoch framework, has a boundary. Not an open expanse, but a sealed structure with guarded points of entry. The Lafafa Sedek states that when Christ arrived at the gates, the cry that went up from the third compartment, the murdered, whose blood had not yet been avenged, ceased. The text treats this cessation as a signal. The account of blood was being settled. The Ge'ez text at this point uses a term for this settlement that scholars studying the Ethiopian manuscripts have connected to the concept of a completed transaction. Dr. Ephraim Isaac, in his notes attached to the 1983 translation, identifies this Ge'ez construction as carrying the same legal finality as a bill of release, a debt discharged in full. The cry stopped because what the murdered dead had been crying for was about to be rendered from inside the structure itself by someone who had descended into it with the authority to do so. The Ethiopian tradition preserves a specific framework for understanding why the descent was necessary and what its primary purpose was. It is drawn from the Gadla Adam, part of the broader Ethiopian corpus dealing with the early history of humanity, and from anaphora texts, the liturgical prayers of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which encode theological content that the mainstream Western traditions do not retain. The framework is this: when Adam died, he carried a debt. Not simply the moral weight of disobedience in the garden, but a specific covenant relationship that had been broken, a relationship requiring restoration before the righteous dead could be released from their compartment. The first hollow space in Enoch's four-part structure, where the righteous dead wait in brightness, is a holding place. They are not in torment, but they cannot ascend. Something prevents their release. The Ethiopian texts identify that something as the unresolved covenant between humanity and its creator, the breach initiated by Adam's choice in the garden. The righteous dead, regardless of their individual righteousness, carry the mark of that original breach. They cannot cross the boundary between the holding place and the presence of God until the breach is resolved. The descent of Christ, in this framework, is not primarily about defeating Satan. It is about retrieving Adam. Specifically, about completing the covenant transaction that Adam's death left unfinished, and in completing it, releasing not just Adam but everyone in that first compartment who had been held there awaiting the resolution. Every righteous soul who ever lived before the crucifixion. Everyone who had been faithful to the covenant in their lifetime and who had died, still carrying the mark of Adam's original breach. They all waited in the bright compartment, waiting for someone to come in and close the account. The Ge'ez anaphora texts use specific language for this transaction. The term meshagert, which carries the sense of a sealed agreement or covenant document, appears in liturgical passages that describe Christ descending to Sheol to present the completed sacrifice as the fulfillment of Adam's broken covenant. The sacrifice has already happened at the cross. The descent is the moment of filing, the the presentation of the completed account to the record held in the structure beneath, like a legal transaction where the work and the documentation are two separate acts. One happens above, the other happens below. Here the Enoch framework becomes directly relevant in a way that scholars have noted but rarely discussed openly. In chapter 10 of the book of Enoch, the archangel Michael is given a specific instruction regarding Sheol, the leader of the 200 watchers who descended to Mount Hermon before the flood. Michael is told to bind Sheol and his associates for 70 generations beneath the earth. 70 generations. In the ancient Jewish reckoning preserved in the Enoch manuscripts, one generation equals approximately 30 years. 70 generations equals 2,100 years. The text records the binding as occurring before the flood. If the flood event corresponds to the late 4th millennium BCE, then the sentence of 70 generations would have been calculated to expire sometime in the 1st century CE. The sentence of the Watchers, in Enoch's own framework, was scheduled to end around the time of Christ. This is not an inference. It is arithmetic applied to numbers the text itself provides, and it creates an extraordinary alignment with what 1 Peter 3:19 describes. Christ, after his death, went to the spirits in prison, those who had not obeyed in the days of Noah. The spirits Peter is referencing, without explicitly citing Enoch, are Sheol and the Watchers. The proclamation Christ made to them during those 3 days was not a rescue. It was a sentencing. Their 7-0 generation term was complete, and the judge had arrived to render the final determination. The Ethiopian manuscripts preserve this connection more explicitly than any Western text. The Gaze tradition, drawing on both Enoch and the early apostolic writings, describes the encounter between Christ and Sheol and the imprisoned Watchers, not as a rescue mission, but as a legal proceeding. Dr. James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame, one of the foremost living scholars of Enochic literature, noted in his 2004 work on the Book of Enoch that the 7-0 generation sentence creates a temporal alignment with the 1st century that no commentator has been willing to address directly. The numbers work out. The alignment is precise, and nobody has said clearly what that means. 2 separate events are happening inside Sheol during those 3 days. In the first compartment, the righteous dead are about to be released through the completion of Adam's covenant. In the fourth compartment, the imprisoned Watchers are receiving the final rendering of a sentence that has been running for over 2,000 years. One event is a release. The other is a finalization. Both are described in texts the Ethiopian church kept and the Western church discarded. The structure Jesus entered carries a striking parallel to the Egyptian concept of the duat, the realm of the dead through which the soul must pass before reaching the judgment hall of Osiris. This is not coincidence. It is the persistence of a cosmological framework that preceded both Hebrew and Egyptian religious formalization and left its imprint on both. The duat in Egyptian theology is not a single space. It is a structured sequence of regions, each governed, each guarded, each requiring specific authorization to enter and pass through. The Book of the Dead, which the Egyptians themselves called the Book of Coming Forth by Day, describes this passage in detail. 42 divine judges preside over the weighing of the heart. The soul must know specific words, specific names, specific protocols to navigate each region without being destroyed. What the Ethiopian texts preserve and what the Egyptian texts map from a different angle is the same underlying geography. A sealed underworld with structured compartments, guarded entry points, different categories of inhabitants at different levels, and a process of authorization required to move through it. The connection runs through the long period of Israelite contact with Egypt and through Alexandria, where both traditions met for centuries. The Aksum texts are not purely Semitic. They carry traces of the older Egyptian layer in their cosmological vocabulary, the terms for sealed spaces, for light and darkness, for the voice that cried from below. When the Ethiopian Ge'ez texts describe Christ entering the gates of Sheol, the language they use for those gates parallels the language the Egyptians used for the gates of the Duat, not borrowed from each other. Parallel. 2 records of the same territory, written by different hands, pointing at the same structure. The Babylonian tradition offers a third angle on this. In the descent of Inanna to the underworld, one of the oldest narrative texts in human history, the goddess removes a piece of her divine regalia at each of 7 gates before arriving at the throne of her sister Ereshkigal in the realm of the dead. She goes down, stripped of everything that marks her divine status, passing through each gate by surrendering another layer of identity and power until she arrives at the lowest point with nothing. And then she rises. This descent and return narrative predates the Hebrew tradition by at least 1,000 years, and predates the Christian narrative by 3,000. What it preserves is the cosmological logic of a divine being, who can enter the realm of the dead and return, but only by agreeing to the terms of the passage, not by force. By submission followed by authority. Down through the gates with nothing, back through the gates with everything. The parallel to the three-day descent described in the Ethiopian Bible is structural. Christ dies, stripped of divine invulnerability by the incarnation itself, descends into the realm of the dead, completes the transaction he came to complete, and returns through the boundary between death and life carrying what he went to retrieve. The Babylonian tradition describes the logic. The Ethiopian Bible describes the specific content applied to a specific historical person at a specific moment. The Sumerian tablet known to scholars as the Anzu fragment, analyzed in reconstructed form by Dr. Nadia Voss at the Free University of Berlin, describes a boundary between the upper and lower realms as something that can open and close. The Sumerian compound, an Abzubala, which Voss translates as the upper deep opening from beneath, implies that the boundary yields to someone approaching from inside the lower realm with the right kind of authority, not from above pushing down. From below, pushing up. The boundary opens inward, from the inside out, under the right conditions. The Ethiopian texts describe the resurrection in exactly this way. Christ does not simply return to life in the tomb. He comes back through the boundary from the other side, carrying with him the first fruits of those who had been waiting in the righteous compartment. Matthew 27-52 notes briefly, and without elaboration, that the tombs opened after the resurrection, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. Matthew does not explain this. He just records it. The Ethiopian tradition explains what Matthew left out. Those were the inhabitants of the first compartment, the ones who had been waiting since before the flood. Released by the completion of the covenant transaction that Christ presented to the record held inside the structure of death itself, the Western canon does not contain the Laphafa Sedek. It does not contain the Gadla Adam in its full form. It does not contain Enoch. The Council of Laodicea in 364 CE removed Enoch specifically. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, classified the Enochic texts as too detailed about angelic structures to be included in a canon intended for general circulation. Augustine dismissed the geographical specificity of the underworld description as allegory, arguing in the City of God that places of punishment exist outside creation rather than within it. But Enoch says, within, measurably within. With walls and compartments and crying voices and beings who can be named and located, none of the council members who made these decisions had access to the Gaze tradition. None of them could read the Axum manuscripts. What they were working with were fragmentary copies, largely in Greek, of texts whose full form had been preserved independently in Ethiopia. They were not making decisions based on the complete record. Each subsequent council decision narrowed the surviving text further, until what the Western tradition had finally retained was a fraction of what the Ethiopian Church had never stopped reading in its original Ge'ez form. The decision to exclude Enoch and the associated texts had a specific effect on Western Christianity's ability to understand its own central event. Without Enoch chapter 22, the structure of Sheol is invisible. Without Enoch chapter 10, the 7-0 generation sentence and its first-century expiry are invisible. Without the Laphafa Sedek and the anaphora tradition, the covenant transaction framework for the descent is invisible. Without the Gadla Adam, the Adam retrieval narrative is invisible. What remains when all of those elements are removed is a single verse in 1 Peter, floating in the text without context. He went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison. The Western tradition never gave that sentence the framework it needs to be understood. The Ethiopian tradition preserved every piece of that framework and kept them all in the same canon. Dr. Ephraim Isaac spent years working with the Axum manuscript tradition. His 1983 Oxford translation of the Ge'ez Enoch remains the most comprehensive English-language engagement with the Ethiopian textual source. In the notes attached to that translation, he observed that the Ge'ez manuscripts preserve a layer of theological content, especially concerning the structure of the afterlife and the significance of the descent of Christ, that does not exist in any Western language edition and that has never been incorporated into mainstream theological scholarship. 72 hours, 3 days. The texts describe it as the most consequential sequence of events in the history of the created order, not because of what happened on the cross alone, but because of what happened immediately after. The cross was the completion of the sacrifice. The descent was the delivery. What Christ brought into Sheol was a completed covenant, the fulfilled terms of the agreement that Adam broke, the account settled in full. What he did in those 3 days was present that settlement to the record held in the underworld structure, to the chambers, to the imprisoned, to the waiting. The righteous dead in the first compartment had been there for millennia, from before the flood through every generation of the patriarchs, through the entire period covered by the Hebrew Bible. Everyone who had died in faith and had been held, not in torment but in suspension, waiting for the account to be settled. The moment it was settled, the waiting was over. Matthew 27-52 has confused Western commentators for 2,000 years. Dead people rising from their tombs after the crucifixion is a strange detail to insert and then leave unexplained. The Ethiopian tradition explains it. They did not rise because of some secondary miracle operating independently of the resurrection. They rose because Christ had descended into the compartment where they were held, presented the completed covenant, and the gates had opened, not from the outside. From within? The Gaze texts say the gates opened because the covenant was fulfilled from the inside, from within the structure of death itself, by someone who had entered it with the authority to satisfy its terms. This is what the Ethiopian Bible says happened during those 72 hours. Not an absence, not a silence, not a mystery the church wisely decided not to speculate about. A sequence of specific events in a specific structure, described in texts the Ethiopian church has held for 16 centuries, connected by a coherent framework that draws on Enoch, on the Anaphora tradition, on the Gaze manuscripts at Axum, and on the older layers of both the Egyptian and Babylonian cosmological inheritance that preceded them all. The manuscripts are still in Axum. The Gaze text is still there. The Lafafa Sedek is still used in Ethiopian Orthodox worship today, read aloud in the same Ge'ez language in which it was first written, in churches built on a tradition that was ancient when Rome was still deciding which books to keep. The texts that explain the 3 days have not disappeared. They have simply been waiting, the same way the righteous dead waited in the bright compartment for someone to arrive with the authority to open what had been sealed. If you want to go deeper on what the Ethiopian Bible contains that Western Christianity never heard, there is another video on this channel that covers exactly that. The link is on your screen right now. Everything in the Ethiopian canon that the councils removed is documented, referenced, and laid out in the same format you just watched. Click it. The answers are not as buried as the councils wanted them to be.